we have the next standalone presentation. And for the next standalone presentation, I take the opportunity and would like to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Shankar Sundarrajan, Partner Technology and Transformation Financial Services at Deloitte India. The topic for the same would be where India's financial future gets built. Can we please give a round of applause and welcome Mr. Shankar Sundarrajan up on the dais.
Where India's future gets built. Before we jump in, right, I had, as consultants, we have the opportunity to travel wide and far. And a couple of weeks back, I did go to couple emerging nations, right? And what we take for granted in India, in terms of when it comes to digital public infrastructure, is something of a journey that most of the emerging economies are wanting to cover. Was a discovery that I personally first-hand experienced, be it the identity services, be it UPI at scale, and the transaction throughput that it handles, and where I was struggling to pay cash to the cabbie in the emerging economy, and it made me realize, and a couple others who were traveling, a couple of colleagues realized that the journey that we have covered in India in the last 10 years has been unprecedented, right? The velocity at which we have transformed as a nation is something that the world is watching very, very keenly. And what we want to talk about is, we've gotten here. Now, what is the next step? How do we go? Where do we go from here, right? In terms, that's where India's future gets built, right? In terms of when you look at, and it's multitude of forces coming together, right? What has resulted in India transforming the way it is done. Be it the public infrastructure, which we all know, which is being talked about globally a lot. The policy revolution, and here kudos to the regulator. We have one of the most progressive regulators here who absolutely ensures that innovation with guardrails is something that is a possibility. And the consumer protection is at the epicenter of any innovation that is being done, right? And when we look at the private innovation is being driven by fintechs, banks, and all the technology players. The foundational bedrock of innovation is enabled by the public infrastructure. So all of the fintechs, the banks can focus on differentiation, can focus on how to differentiate on the customer experience. How should they radically be thinking about product value proposition? Because the core table stakes of value proposition delivery is something that the public infrastructure is doing all the heavy lifting on, right? And when we talk about innovation, we absolutely look at it from the lens of trust and inclusion in terms of ease, as we say, innovation for all, sabka saath, sabka vikas. That's the motto of the current dispensation, and that's something that we see translating itself into the financial services ecosystem, right? The question is not about what technology where, it's about where is it going to take us and what's the journey that we're going to take from here. When we look at, and this is, sorry for the shameless plug, most of the content here is from a recent Deloitte publication called The State of Financial Services in India. It is a very flagship publication that takes into account on where Indian financial services ecosystem is today and what is the journey ahead and what should the regulator be doing. There is a call to action for the regulator, for the government. In fact, our CEO had the opportunity to meet Madam Finance Minister and talk through the report as well, right? So all the data is out there. You can download the report. It's a great read, right? In terms of when we come in, what are the 8 shifts that we see, right? On the backs of what we're talking about, the bedrock of innovation being the digital public infrastructure. So if you look at digital public infrastructure, all of it table stakes, UPI, payment and collections, Aadhaar, we all know that video KYC is table stakes today. Again, account aggregator is something that is growing in how, right? E-sign and documentation. And trust me, when you travel to other geographies, the difference becomes stark. You realize what you take for granted in India is something of a luxury, is considered a luxury. in the other geographies, right? What is the key shift that we are seeing because of the innovation being standardized and the digital public infrastructure is the movement, right? Banking is no longer all about product provisioning. It's about need servicing. There is a clear pivot, right? And that's where banks are forced in India or consciously pushed to take a choice. Do they want to distribute? Do they want to manufacture? What do they want to do where, right? And that in turn entails the business model that they choose to go after. Be it banking as a service or banking as a platform, right? All of this, the underpinning need is to be where the customer is, to embed yourself in the customer journeys. That's the new norm. That's the new normal that is being enabled, right? And when we talk about AI, Babu did mention about AI being a bedrock, right? What we are increasingly seeing is AI is no longer pilot, right? The conversations that we are having with financial institutions in India are more come of age, right? How do you reimagine an end-to-end process? It's moving away from pilots to actually talking some hard metrics in terms of what does the reimagined operating model look like? What does the human plus model look like? How do you embed and make the look at employee productivity as one of the key metrics, right? That's where we are seeing AI pilots, and they're moving from pilots to core operations, right? MSME, we've heard a lot, 63 million MSMEs. The target market is there for everybody to capture, be it fintechs, be it banks. In all the conversations, we get to hear all of this, that the MSME is a hotspot, and there is a lot of governmental push, right, from a policy standpoint as well, in terms of how do you make cash aware, how do you make loans available to MSME? How do you get them into the formal credit net? Right? Out of the 63 million, there are only around 20% of the MSMEs who are in the formal credit net as per the last numbers that I checked upon. Right? In terms of how do you look at alternative data models, given we are now looking at interconnected ecosystems, right? Interconnected ecosystems, interconnected journeys, that's going to deliver, is going to result in us being a data-rich nation, which is going to seed the seeds of alternative credit lending models, right? How do we look at alternative data for credit decisioning? And to give a shout out, NBFCs are doing a phenomenal job here in terms of when it comes to obsessing about a customer segment, sharpening the product proposition within that segment, understanding, underwriting for that segment. I think NBFCs need a round of applause in terms of how they are embedding themselves into the MSME ecosystem and solving the need for credit. Right? Hyper-personalization through analytics, as I said, it's all about customer journeys, it's all about reimagining processes. When we talk about customer journeys, when we talk about reimagining business processes, I think all of us are trying to do it with a data-first lens. In terms of how do I garner more and more context about my consumer? Right? And that's what is going to help us move from a probabilistic world that we are all dabbling in to a more deterministic world. The more the context of the consumer, the more the insights are going to be richer. And the more the sharper is going to be the value proposition and the interaction that banks and financial institutions, insurers have with their end consumers. Right? Digital is table stakes, right? We all know. But the key point that, in fact, we've come to realize it's not about digitization anymore. It's about interconnected ecosystems, right? And that is exactly where, and there is a fundamental nuance that I want to bring in terms of why I'm reinforcing that it's not about digitization anymore, is it's not about interlinking of eKYC and streamlining the account onboarding journey. It's about making the onboarding journey all pervasive, any channel, any ecosystem. Right? The Lego blocks from the digital public infrastructure are all there and have been there, but it's time to reimagine the journeys. All of this, given the trust, interconnectedness, given the consumer trusting financial institutions with data, all of this results in zooming in, doubling down on the focus on operational resilience, right? In terms of how do you handle the consumer data? How do you ensure the consumer is trusting you with his choices, with his data? How do you handle that carefully? Right? And how do you ensure, minimize the cyber disruptions? which is where the entire gamut of how you are looking at cyber as a value proposition, right? Cyber as a business, cyber as a vertical within the banks. It's no longer a horizontal because the data is, as a data custodian, banks, financial institutions, and insurers are now becoming custodians of the vertical choices that the consumer is making. Okay? The last but not the least is what is one of my favorites. As Nandan keeps reiterating, he was the one who coined FinInternet, and he is the one who talks about it often. But truly, tokenization and digital asset infrastructure is something that every money that is moved in the system, right, is going to be tokenized. That's the future that we're envisioning. And that's the future that financial institutions need to be ready for. Right? The digital public infrastructure is rapidly scaling itself. How do we, as financial institutions, be it NBFCs, be it insurers, be ready for it, is the key question. When we look at, as I said, innovation is no longer constrained by access. Some of the startling numbers are 85.5% plus households with smartphones, right? 958 million plus users, active internet users. No wonder there have been you have had a lot of involved conversations on the WhatsApp CEO, the new CEO being named from an Indian consumer firm, right? 23.2 billion UPI transactions, right? And the value is around 29.9 lakh crores. All of it is pivoting to intelligent finance. And intelligent finance is going to be underpinned by how much you know about your consumer, how interconnected are the data ecosystems, right? And that is where when you're talking about interconnected ecosystems, you have to obsess about relevance. How are you remaining relevant to your end consumers? How are your value propositions remaining relevant? Right? If you look at, again, it's when we think about India, when we think about the next generational value propositions, we keep hearing agentic, we keep hearing Gen AI, right? We should not think, at least we at Deloitte believe that we should not be thinking about it from digitization alone, but it is the digital architecture. And believe me, half of the job is already done with the digital public infrastructure, the maturity of what's being made available to us, and the leaps and bounds of evolution that is happening every day, right? If you look at how many account aggregators have been here for 3+ years now, look at the numbers. There are 989 FIUs today and 179 FIPs, right? And when I speak to BG Mahesh, who also happens to be a dear friend, he talks about that insurance companies are using it, banks are using it, wealth management firms are using it, NBFCs are using it. I think everybody is using it and contributing to it as well. Because it's a symbiotic relationship. Today you might be an FIU, but tomorrow you will be an FIP. That's how the interconnectedness of the ecosystem we see it evolving. Right? And the underlying foundational principle is trust. Right? How do you embed trust in the architecture? That's what is going to define the next phase. So if you look at, as we call it, the consultants are always jargonizing things. There are 3 I's, infrastructure, intelligence, and integration. We've spoken a lot about infrastructure, we've spoken a lot about integration. But I personally believe that we've spoken a lot about intelligence. I personally believe that integration is going to be the most important lever in the entire equation, right? In terms of how do you create this interconnected ecosystem where the consumer is the king and he has a myriad of choices to choose from. And that's where, going back to my original point, banks strategically have a where to play question to answer in terms of do they want to distribute, do they want to manufacture, or do they want to do both. That's the time right now. It's time to sit back and think in terms of what my next 10 years are going to look like. Because the ecosystem is evolving rapidly. And this is to close the presentation. These are some of the strategic imperatives which we believe at Deloitte have been, and they are available in the report as well for your consumption. Some of the policy outlook, policy changes that we are requesting is how do you deepen debt markets, right? There is an inherent change. For the bankers in the room, it's no news, no new news, right? The deposit pie is shrinking, right? And no longer you can look at lending being funded by deposits, right? How do you deepen the debt markets is one of the key things we've examined, and we have also requested the government and the regulator to take a look at in terms of how can this be a horizon for banks to raise capital, right? AI in everything that we do, right? AI is at the epicenter. It's not knocking at the door, it's right in the room. It's the elephant in the room, right? How do you rewire? And when you think about AI, when you think about digital, resilience and risk at the forefront is something, it's a forethought, not an afterthought in terms of how do you think about all of that, right? And how do you ensure resilience is embedded in your operating model, be it your people, tech, and systems, right? How do you think about it? When we come to NBFCs, we believe that cash flow based MSME lending, there's been a lot of talk, there's a lot of policy pushes that have come in, but I think the time is here in terms of looking at alternative data, looking at account aggregator, how the aggregator framework is evolving. And absolutely one of the key things that we believe is tokenization, right, is going to be one of the very important levers, which is going to help unlock value in terms of for MSMEs and for the economy as a whole. And that's why I personally am a big fan of FinInternet when Nandan talks about it passionately in terms of what's the next revolution going to be, right? Coming to insurance, it's going to be protection-led. That's something that we are seeing. It's going to be expanding to protection-led. Most of the insurance companies are pivoting to that, right? Data-driven underwriting and claims is something that we are seeing. It's going to be increasingly a focus area for insurers as the infrastructure evolves itself, right? And AI is going to fundamentally transform the current insurance operating model. And we don't say it, we are actively seeing it happen, right? And that's, in a nutshell, what I wanted to talk about, right? When we say the infrastructure is here, how do you think about the future? Thank you. Hope you guys find it useful.